Hey everyone, I'm Rather Incoherent, and today I wanted to do an analysis video on why my table pretty much never plays main fighters as mystics, or mystics as main fighters, whichever way you want to look at it. And it's because mechanically we think mystics really struggle with the role. There's a lot of things required of a main fighter that mystics just aren't great at, and today I'll be using the scenario The Midnight Mask from the Night of the Zealot, the tutorial, to really show off exactly what the three roles of a fighter are. And when I say a fighter, a main fighter, I mean like it's your job to deal with the enemies that spawn and you're protecting a main clover. There's somebody who is defenseless and somebody who is unable to find clues, and together they are stronger than two flexes would be, is the idea when you pair main fighter and main clover, as opposed to just having two flex characters. The reason I've set up this board is to show off the three different ways that you might need to manage as a fighter. The first is if your clover draws an enemy, you need to deal with it. Sometimes it'll be hunting Night God, it'll be a big guy, sometimes it'll be rats. But job number one is kill every enemy drawn by both you and the main clover. I'm going to generalize that out to kill and counter deck enemies that spawn engaged with the team, because even if a flex character draws an enemy, if neither you or the clover drew one, it's frequently the case that a main fighter can help the team by saying, hey, Joe Diamond, you don't need to kill that guy, I'll do it for you and you can get clues, because I'm never going to get clues, and clues is how you win. So this is obviously the first and most important thing you have to do. If your main clover draws a rat and has to skip their turn, which has happened to me recently, it's very, very bad. You need to be able to deal with the and counter deck enemies, and if you sign up as main fighter, you're saying that you can deal with it for all of your enemies, all of the clovers, and even sometimes help out a flex. The second thing you have to do though is kill the ones that don't spawn with you. This is actually the harder job, because stuff like acolytes, the enemies that spawn at adjacent locations, empty locations, furthest locations, always have some terrible effect that makes the game bad, such as interplay with one doom. Sometimes you get lucky, acolyte spawns in the last doom and he's basically just the guy who even cares, you'll kill him eventually. But it's usually bad to allow enemies like the acolyte to survive at distant locations, even if they end up losing their doom immediately with no penalty, and very frequently as the fighter, your most important job is go kill this guy. Letting him live costs us an entire round, go kill the acolyte, right? So the secondary job is to kill distant spawn enemies, which is how I'll term things like the acolyte, that have ongoing penalty effects. You can't just let them hang out over there. There are some enemies where it's a non-hunter enemy, it's just like the generic 2/2/2 ghoul without hunter, and you can trip that guy and leave him behind and he can stay on the map forever and it will never matter. Those guys don't have to be killed necessarily, but there are tons of enemies where the whole point is you have to go find them and kill them, otherwise something bad will happen, and that's just as important as dealing with the Night God that your clover drew. And the third job of the fighter, which is why I picked Midnight Mask, I knew it would be right here, is to kill boss enemies. You're going to have enemies like this, packed before you do formatting, where even in 2-player, this is an 8 health guy with 4 fists. You just have to be able to kill the big dudes that spawn at the end of every scenario. However, I will say that you can expect some help on boss enemies. Boss enemies are often the hardest part of the scenario. It costs your clover very little to run one occult lexicon, costs your Foot Matters flex rogue very little to run 1 backstab 3 or 2 backstab 0s. You should expect people to help to some degree with the boss. This is definitely the one you have to focus on at the least of the 3 jobs. And you might see that these all start with kill and think the fighter job just boils down to you need to be able to kill things good, and that's definitely part of it. Because I don't actually really care much about the main fighter jobs. I care about what are the requirements to perform those roles. And obviously number one is deal damage good, right? Like you just need to be able to deal damage to kill this guy, that guy, even this guy with only 1 health. You got to be able to deal 1 damage to something with 3 fists really reliably to go deal with acolytes efficiently. Main fighting requires more than just dealing damage effectively though. Because in this situation where you need to go kill an acolyte, you come up here, you flip the location, you deal with the acolyte, right? And that's probably going to be your last action of the turn. It's not going to be move, swing, move. It's going to be like move, swing, and now that he's dead, you take a turn. I don't even have dex down, don't worry about it. But you like set up an asset you're going to need for further fighting. There's a lot of ongoing setup that happens with fighters, ongoing maintenance, especially mystic fighters who will need to recharge assets occasionally. It's very normal for a fighter to end their turn a location away from the clover and hope that the clover gets to them. Let's say your clover's at a location with higher shroud than 1, and they don't finish their location, you end up ending your turn like this. And then the turn starts, and oh no, Daisy drew the Night Gaunt and you're a location away. And now you have a very serious problem, right? This demonstrates the most important thing for fighters, beyond just being able to deal damage. You need good movement hacks. You need shortcut, pathfinder, safeguard, just tons of extra actions and rogues that can be used for anything, whether that be stabbing or moving to the place that you're going to do the stabbing. You need a good way to move around, because when you go to deal with the distant enemies like acolytes, when you go do job number 2, it can very often put yourself in a situation where dealing with the Night Gaunt next turn is more difficult. Or another Acolyte spawns. It doesn't even have to be the Night Gaunt this turn. This Acolyte spawns and you have to just put him in front of you, otherwise you're not getting into him this turn. So you move even further and open yourself to even more turns down the line where the same thing can happen, right? It is incredibly important that you have good movement as a fighter. Cloovers just get clues at a location, and when they're done, they move to the next location. Fighters get pulled around the map in a way that Cloovers don't. Very few scenarios will change this. And I'm actually going to, at this point, add a couple of asterisks under deal damage good, and those are variable increments and with high burst. Because you could theoretically play a campaign where you just have enough flamethrower rounds to kill every rat you see with flamethrower, and the damage increment of 4 is just good enough. You don't need to do anything else. But realistically, in almost every campaign with every weapon source, you need to meter out your resources. Which means rather than using your strongest attack every time, you want to use like a basic punch at 5 to 3 on an Acolyte, and then bust out the flamethrower on the Night Gaunt. And that really can't just be one line where I define that good damage is damage in variable increments with high burst. Sometimes the increment for rogues is just that you always deal 2 damage, but you determine how many actions you're going to get in that round, and can do a lot more than 3 increments of 2 if you need to. The increment's not how much damage you're doing, but how many actions you're committing to dealing that damage. And with high burst just indicates you have some ability to deal with the boss. Very few characters are dealing with Night Gaunts and Acolytes in the exact same way that they're going to deal with the final boss. On the final boss, they'll mix in things like a sweeping kick to get an extra round of combat. They'll mix in skills like Vicious Blow and Strong Arm that they might not have needed to use on smaller enemies, right? So these are the 2 main things that a fighter really desperately needs. You need to deal damage good, and good is not just a high increment, but it's either an endless high increment in the case of infinite ammo on a charge-based or ammo-based asset, or it's the ability to augment that with like high fist basic attacks on rats, beat cops, some backup weapon like a branding thug, that sort of thing. And with high burst, unless your basic increment's just so high that you're going to not need burst, which is rarely the case, but it does happen with stuff like flamethrower builds. And then the other thing that you desperately need is good movement, but there is a third thing that you need as well. You're going to need good soak. Because let's go back to the starting situation where Daisy drew a Night Gaunt, right? That's not a problem. What if you both drew a Night Gaunt though? How are you going to deal with that? And the answer can't be, oh, I'll deal with mine, and then Daisy will just have to skip her turn or do the best she can. Your job as fighter is not to kill every enemy. Not necessarily. Like, obviously that's the best way to fight. If all the enemies are dead, you've done a wonderful job. But your job as fighter is to make sure that the Clover, and preferably the rest of your team as well, are free to do their job. As long as enemies aren't impeding anyone's ability to play the game, you as the fighter have done your job. And you will have situations like this, where it's scenario 2, you don't have a flamethrower, 2 4 health enemies spawned, and one of them's on you and one of them's on your Clover, and it is basically impossible with the hand you are given to deal with both of them at once, but you still have to solve this problem, even though you can't kill them both. In this situation, the correct play, provided your Daisy is not going to die to autofail and you're beating the bag and you only miss on autofail, which good fighters can do, it's just to swing over twice at the Night Gaunt, kill that guy, and then maybe hit this guy once and end your turn with him still alive, and you'll have to soak the damage. Because as a fighter, it's frequently the case that bad RNG will happen and you find yourself in a situation where there's an enemy that cannot be killed this turn. And the best way to deal with it, like let's say you were up here, that's the Night Gaunt. Let's say you were up here as Jacqueline, we don't need this guy, and Daisy drew this enemy. Do you know what Jacqueline does in this turn? The correct play is move, engage. That's all. Jacqueline does that, and effectively Daisy gets to keep playing the game. Does Jacqueline like doing that? No, not at all. It's a terrible turn, you hate doing it. But it's the only way to let Daisy take her turn. And because when you have these bad RNG turns where enemies get to survive, and it's your job to make sure no one else is skipping their turn because of enemies, that means you need good soak. Those are the 2 main non-fighting requirements that you need to have to be a good fighter. I think it's very funny that I'm bringing up my Lily Chen deck I'm currently playing in Dark Matter as an example of a great fighter to show off how to do these things well, since Lily Chen is a mystic, but she's actually a guardian in a trench coat. Don't believe her lies, just you can't trust the color when looking at Edge of the Earth investigators. Now in terms of dealing damage effectively, we have Spectral Razor as a fighting event, we have Machete, one of them at least, 2 Dragon Pulse, 2 Operated Runic Axis, and 2 Brands of Kathaga, so plenty of weapon density. Our main weapon, what we're really looking for, this Runic Axe, is able to swing at +3 for 2 damage, +5 for 3 damage, or plus fucking 7 for 4 damage. A huge part of what makes Runic Axe so incredible is that baseline, it handles the increment of damage on its own, as well as capping out at incredibly bursty increments. And if I miss Runic Axe, I have plenty of other completely fine weapons available in the deck. It's not like I'm all in on finding this, and the deck's pretty high draw with Guts, Manual Dex, Overpower, and the Proxied ready for anything. Not like incredible draw, but better than some Guardians for sure. In terms of Soak, I'm not really running Talisman of Protection for that. I just need something for density for Dragon Pull if I miss the Runic Axe. I've pretty much just got all of McBride and the ability to heal with the Ready for Anything proxy over here for a little bit of horror damage, which is really only counteracting by the thick of it trauma. Lily's actually fairly frail on the Soak front. The reason she gets away with it is because when you're swinging Dragon Pull at 8 with unlimited ammunition in scenario 1, you're so much better than killing, or so much better at killing than most investigators, that you can get by with less Soak because you're less likely to need it. That's sort of how that can balance out. And then on the movement hacks front, I'm using 2 of my 5 level 0 Guardian cards for Safeguard because it is one of the best cards in the game. Safeguard 0 is incredible. It's basically a slotless Leo DeLuca for 2 resources in the vast majority of games. It's absolutely incredibly strong, and it's how I'm handling getting more movement out of my character. And there are a ton of different ways to accomplish this, right? You can have a deck using Flamethrower with Branding Thug as the backup weapon, and then your main increment is 4, but Branding Thug is a backup for 2. And if you just need to punch a rat, you can punch a rat because you're a Guardian. Safeguard is obviously one way of doing this. You have actions like Leo DeLuca and Black Fan for big money fighters and Rogue. You have things like Scout, what's it called? Scout Ahead? Yeah, Rogues have Scout Ahead, which is essentially their version of Shortcut. Obviously, anyone with off-color Seeker access has Shortcuts. There's plenty of ways to get some movement hacks into your deck, and you just need at least a couple of them. Whether it's recursive assets or one-off events, you need the ability to say, oh no, I'm too far out of position. I've had to go far off the beaten path to deal with an Acolyte. How do I get back? In the example of Safeguard, you don't even really need to go far off the beaten path. You can be like, hey, Kluber, as your last action, can you walk to the next location expecting the flex to deal with this? And then I'll just deal with the Acolyte when you get there. And with Safeguard 2, it's even better because then you can like go in front of them and take the Acolyte off of them. Safeguard 2 is absolutely incredible for like not just being a good fighter, but allowing your team to play turns they otherwise couldn't. So this is a great example of like how you deal good damage, how you have good weapon density, how you don't really necessarily need great Soak, just a little bit of Soak if you're good at killing, and what constitutes great movement hacks. And my issue now is I'm not really sure what the best way to show the lack of something is. Because I could go through every one of these Mystic assets at level 0, and none of them are recursive movement hacks. There is nothing even remotely on par with a Safeguard. None of them do it. The closest thing they have is a Summon Servitor upgrade path is available, where it can give you a little bit of movement, but Summon Servitor is still much more expensive than a Safeguard. It requires a lot of experience, not a ton, but a lot, to get going, because it's something you're getting before anything else, right? If you're immediately buying your movement hack, then you're not immediately buying whatever else you could have been buying. There's opportunity cost. But additionally, Wings of Night, while it is movement and Mystic, it's movement and Mystic that is going to cost you, one, getting it set up is more expensive than an asset. It's not that it's a 2-cost 2-slot thing, because you change that. The cost is that you have to discard an asset you control, which is very hard to do turn 1, and you need movement hacks off the bat. There's always a huge difference in a Guardian that hits Safeguard turn 1 and turn 5 in terms of how efficiently they set up. Same thing will be true with a Summon Servitor, which you cannot set up efficiently on turn 1. Additionally, Wings of Night only allows you to move one location around. There are scenarios that's fine in, but there are also scenarios where Safeguard level 2 has given me an average of like 2.5 moves a turn, as I just got carried around by a Kluver from Seeker at breakneck pace, right? It'd be fine if this was just guaranteeing you one action a turn like a Pathfinder, but because the Summon Servitor actually stays behind, you can find yourself in awkward positions where Summon Servitor is just gone. It's just been ditched, especially on maps that have like teleports from one location to another that are actions on cards and not actually map connections, because then the Summon Servitor can't take those. So Summon Servitor is the closest they have to a recursive movement ability in terms of assets, but it's not really good enough. And then if you go over to their events, which I'll do shortly after scrolling through all of this to see if I'm missing anything, but if you go over to events, they really don't have anything there either. Movement is one of the clear and intentional weaknesses of this class. Yeah, there's nothing in assets. And if you go over to events, they have stuff like Astral Travel, which is an action to move anywhere that provokes attacks of opportunity, And if you reveal a symbol, you take a damage, or not take a damage, you get crypt shield, and if you can't get crypt shield, then you take a damage. And just 3 cost action to move anywhere is fairly expensive. You have to be playing like really specific scenarios for this to be worth being in your deck at all, because for the 3 resources, a card, and an action, you could have just like gotten the same rate out of 2 or 3 basic move actions, because you didn't pay the resources and you didn't lose the card. This is incredibly expensive, and it doesn't save time if you're just 1 location away. It only helps in very specific situations where you're far, far away. And you don't want a bunch of cards in your deck that are for the worst case only. You want them to be applicable for minorly bad things, not just a disaster. Which, by the way, is largely the same argument I would make when somebody tries to put Dynamite in their deck, is that Dynamite's only useful if things have gone horrifically wrong, and in most circumstances, Dynamite is bad. It's sort of the same thing for Astral Travel in the movement category. Ethereal Slip is similarly difficult to use movement, but it's basically non-applicable for a fighter, since you'd either be teleporting an enemy into a place where you were like out of position and then not dealing with it, or you'd be teleporting away from your party by putting an enemy on top of them. Like, this just doesn't work for a fighter. Open Gate's like a jank scenario tech. It's not something you use for generic movement. It doesn't help you move at all, really, because like adding connections to the map is not the same as movement. It can save your team movement over the course of a game, but it's not movement. And there's just really nothing here in the entire Mystic class for movement, and that's by design. Which is a pretty big problem in my eyes, because dealing with acolytes efficiently is kind of the hallmark of a good fighter for me. So in my opinion, Mystics really struggle with acolytes, and any acolyte variants where you need to go deal with something that's far away, because they lack any sort of movement tech, which as a main fighter really impedes them. If they were a flex, they could go deal with an acolyte. Nobody cares. It's fine for them to be off and on their own self-sufficient. They aren't supposed to be protecting anyone. But as a main fighter, Mystic has a hard time dealing with acolyte, and it only gets worse when you look at their stat line. Going back to the Jacqueline Fine deck, you can see she's got 2 in her fists. She's not going to be basic punching an acolyte, and this is pretty much true across the board. If there's a 4-fist Mystic in the game, they are not coming to mind immediately. So since your Mystics can't punch the acolyte, you're forced to use your assets to kill them. You really don't want to use a Shriveling, and thankfully the card pool is at a point where you can deal with them now. We have access to cards like Sword Cane. Some Mystics with good fist have access to cards like Dragon Pole, which is much better. And the Mystics with card access to stuff like Dragon Pole are much more reliable as main fighters. If I were playing anyone as main fighter for my team, I would want it to be someone like Akachi or Dexter, because those characters are better at making their resources go further. Those characters are better at using infinite weapons like Dragon Pole and Cyclopean Hammer. Those characters are the ones that help to overcome some of the issues they have with damage increments. But like, Sword Cane, while it is a great solution to the problem of I do not want to shrivel an acolyte, it is still a 2-cost hand slot asset that you are being forced to play just to deal with an acolyte. To remind you, most Guardians were trying to play Beat Cop already, and they just punched the guy up 2 and it kills them. And if they get unlucky, they're more than happy to just Beat Cop or Guard Dog the acolyte, and that will kill it, right? Sword Cane is so much worse than the alternative options available, because like, this is an asset to solve a problem that other fighters do not have, is how to voice it. It is a solution, but it's still a solution you are paying for that other fighters don't have to. So right off the bat, because I'm talking about Dragon Pole and Cyclopean Hammer making your resources go so much further, most Mystics aren't great at that. It's really just Akachi and Dexter that stand out to my memory, who are good users of Dragon Pole and are good users of Cyclopean Hammer. And once you're able to use those weapons, that's actually a huge draw for you to play Flex or Fighter, because those weapons are so powerful. But if your card pool and stat line pushes you towards those, I find it only ever pushes you to want to flex with them. Because the backup you have compared to it, like once you've upgraded your Shriveling and your Azure Flame, if you've hit the Dragon Pole, or later on in the campaign, the Cyclopean Hammer, you want, like, if Dexter Drake or Akachi has the Cyclopean Hammer in play, you don't need Azure Flame anymore. You're done. You've got it. This is completely useless. So I find the top end for those characters that are being pushed towards fighting by Dragon Pole, by Cyclopean Hammer, it's actually better as a flex character, because then if you hit your fighting methods, you're straight to the moon fighting with a Cyclopean Hammer and finding clues with Rite of Seeking. But then if you make it into a main fighter, like, your backup weapons are useless if you hit your main weapon. It's not like a flamethrower Brandigathuga sort of deal. And you still have the problem of not having good movement hacks. And I think where I draw the line, like the straw that breaks the camel's back, is on the soak part of it. Because, like, yeah, they get deny 5, but no one's getting deny 5 early. Especially these characters that I was talking about where they're like trying to buy Cyclopean Hammer. That's like the reason to want to play them as a fighter. And when you look at, let's just go to allies, I guess is like the fastest way to look for allies, or for soak rather. There are just like not a lot of options. You have Alyssa Graham, super expensive. Arcane Initiate, not a ton of soak. David Renfield, not a ton of soak. Like everything you're looking at is like 2-1 or less. Some of them are very expensive. Always one of the better things for soak. That's why it was in my Lily deck. And then going up to higher experience, it's very much the same thing. There's not good soak assets available to purple. So these criteria I've laid out for being a good main fighter. Good movement, good increments of damage, good burst damage, and good soak. Mystic sort of fails at all of them unless you're specifically a Dragon Pole Cyclopean Hammer type of character. So when I look at all the Mystics available in the game, if they don't have like at least a 3 in fist for Dragon Pole and Cyclopean Hammer, I don't even see a reason to try to make them work as a main fighter. And going through them, Agnes is a 2, Akachi, as I said, is available. Amina's base head is so shit that even with a Cyclopean Hammer, she's not very effective. She's so focused on making her head work that I can't try to do anything cool with her, so she's not available. I've mentioned Dexter already with a base 3. Diana can try it, but Diana also has a lot of deck density taken up by getting her gimmicks online. Still though, she definitely deserves to be in the running for characters that have a reason to try. Mateo's a 2, Gloria's a 2, surprised it's not a 1, Jacqueline's a 2, Jim's a 3, he could try it. I'm sure that's the Shim build for once. Haku can try it, Lily Chen's not real, Luke is a 2, and Marie is a 1. It's like there are a couple of 4-head Mystics that I feel are really busy trying to either play a Bless build or just trying to overcome his complete lack of a character card, where I don't think, like, I don't want these guys to try to main fight. I want them to focus on overcoming their flaws or building their synergies. It's really just Dexter, Diana, and Akachi that are good with these recursive melee weapons where they overcome their limitations. They're not running Sword Cane just to deal with the problem of the arcane assets. They probably would still run Sword Cane, they would still run the arcane assets, but they have a thing they hit, the Dragon Pole, the Cyclopean Hammer, where it becomes a much better deck. And these characters have a reason to consider trying to play fighter, especially Diana Stanley, who can run a safeguard. Of all the Mystics in the game, Diana Stanley is the only one that I think has a real argument for being played as a main fighter, and it's because of her access to safeguard. Dexter Drake is close. He has Leo DeLuca, he has Cyclopean Hammer, he has the economy to afford both of them. You can absolutely run Dexter as a main fighter. I still think he's better as a super greedy flex character. And Akachi, again, you can run as main fighter, but because of her complete lack of movement, I think she's much worse off than these other two. And I think that you would much rather play her as a flex character. She has a ton of benefits as flex and nothing pushing her towards main fighter. There's no reason to try to take the main fighter role when you could just play Dragon Pole and Cyclopean Hammer and clue finding assets. You don't need to like try to deal with all the acolytes on the board and protecting the Clover as Akachi with your shit movement when you could just be an incredibly powerful self-sufficient flex with the standard Mystic problem of bad movement. And I haven't really mentioned weapon density much because it sort of gets more into deck building than specific requirements of a role. But another thing that all fighters have to do is they have to find their bloody weapons. It's kind of important, right? And Diana's ability will propel her through her deck faster. Dexter Drake does have a little bit of extra draw with stuff like Easy Mark, and Molly Maxwell is a signature that tutors. So I will also say he's a bit better than normal, but in general, Mystics have bad draw. They really struggle to get all of their cards that they want together in a timely fashion, and it's why only Luke Robinson's really able to make a true Magic deck work. A main fighter has to be online after the first Mythos phase. You can't miss your weapons. And obviously you will sometimes, that's the nature of card games, but sometimes has to be a small percentage of the time as possible. And in a class with bad draw, which hilariously Guardians suffer from too, there's just so many reasons not to play these characters as main fighter. I honestly think only Dexter and Diana have good arguments to be main fighter at all, and everyone else, even if they have good arguments they're good at fighting, those arguments fall apart in the main fighter role and really just make them good at flexing. I don't find there's any card pool or synergy that says this Mystic needs to be a fighter. It just isn't in the game right now. There are card pools and synergies that give you incentive to fight more and push you from Clover into flex. And there are a couple of characters that are so good at that flex identity and have so many things helping them that they would probably be as good at main fighter as they are at flex. That's specifically Diana and Dexter. To try to recap succinctly what I view as the Mystic fighter problem is. The first part is that Mystics have bad movement, and good movement is actually more important to fighters than any other role. The second part is that Mystic draw is subpar, and finding your weapons is incredibly important. To be fair, this is a criticism of every class other than Seeker and Survivor, and I actually think Survivor fighters are also in a bad boat, but it is still a criticism worth mentioning. The third part is that unless you're specifically using Dragon Pole and Cyclopean Hammer, I find that their assets aren't great at dealing out the specific increments you need. As I've said before on Rita, being bad at killing rats is really unfortunate because there are a whole lot of rats. Between bad damage increments, bad movement, bad draw, and limited resources, I see no reason to try to make a Mystic my main fighter when I could get the best of their fighting in a flex character and the best of their clue finding and create a self-sufficient flex that's not going to weigh the team down ever. But the moment I try to take on the burden of protecting others, that Mystic mobility really hits like a truck, and it's only Diana with Safeguard, it's only Dexter with Leo DeLuca and Haste, where I really feel like they can play main fighters. Before I wrap up this video, I want to be clear. I'm not saying you can't play Mystic fighters, you obviously can. What I'm saying is that from an optimization standpoint, when you're trying to min-max a character, and you're not saying, what's the best flex I can build out of Diana, or what's the best clover out of Mateo, or what's the best fighter out of Dexter. Instead, you're just saying, what is the best Dexter? How can I squeeze the most out of Dexter? And I really care about this, because that's how I order my tier list. If there's a fighter Dex, and a clover Dex, and then there's also Flexter Drake, and Flexter's far and away the best build, then I need to try out Flexter Drake. From my perspective, whenever I sit down to play any Mystic, I have to build 3 different decks for them because they can run all 3 different builds. And I have to try to analyze which one's the strongest because that's important to how I view the game and how I rank characters on the tier list. And time again, from the optimization viewpoint, it's never fighter. There are a couple of characters that consider it. There are a couple of characters that are really strongly pushed towards at least being a flex, but generally speaking, if you just want to get the most out of a Mystic, being a fighter isn't going to be the way to do that. Being a flex might be the way to do that on certain characters or certain card pools, but the issue with being a fighter as opposed to a flex is that you pick up new responsibilities and new requirements for your job that magnify the inherent weaknesses of Mystic. Their bad soak, their bad mobility, and barring specific weapons that require decent fist, their bad ability to meter out resources and deal with every threat posed to them. So Mystics can be fighters, and the handful of Mystics I've mentioned over and over in this video can even be great fighters. But if you're just trying to make the best possible Gem Culver, there's no reason to ever look twice at Fighter Gem, right? And this is true, writ big or small, across every other Mystic as well. And the reason I use Gem in that example is because Gem is like actually more mono purple than Jacqueline, it feels like. And I say this having looked at every Mystic in the game, built multiple builds for all of them, and over again, when I'm trying to say, this is the best version of a character, I should play this version of, say, Father Mateo, I never end up at Father Mateo the fighter, I never end up at Agnes Baker the fighter. It's always, your ability pushes me into flex, or I don't have a good reason to fight with you, so I'm just gonna play main clover, period. There's never a character where it's like, I have to play fighter, this shit is cracked. Anyways, I think I've said everything I have to say about Mystic fighters. You can expect another video like this coming a Friday sometime soon for the Survivor fighter problem, which is actually on the whole pretty similar to the Mystic fighter problem. They definitely have some of the same issues, but they're not all the same issues. And unlike this, where I'm showing the entire card pool, I'll really just be talking about it from Hank's perspective, because Calvin can star in that too. We'll get to the Survivor fighter problem when we get to the Survivor fighters, but trust me, they also have some struggles in that card pool. For now though, I'm done. I've been rather incoherent. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you disagree, I would love to hear why. I would love to hear your take on why Mystic fighters are worth playing, as opposed to just because you wanted to play a Mystic and fighter was the role left on your team. Thank you for watching. If you could like, comment, and subscribe, I'd greatly appreciate that. And something I tremendously appreciate is all of my supporters over on Patreon and all of the members on YouTube. I'll see all of you in the next one.